Planning a pilot. Hey everyone, Ben Finkel here, and in this nugget, we're going to talk about some overall planning requirements for piloting Office 365 in your organization. Of course, you probably don't want to just cut over your entire organization to Office 365 all at once, so we want to teach you about a few different strategies for planning to test and pilot the migration to Office 365. This planning is all about sussing out or finding out about potential pitfalls that you might have when you migrate your workloads up to Office 365, and doing so in a way that doesn't impact your entire office, your entire user base. So even a moderately sized company, a few hundred employees, could have a real potential impact if there's a problem migrating to Office 365 that you didn't identify ahead of time. So Microsoft itself recommends that you plan to pilot approximately 5% of your users, and this is really important across all lines of business. So you want to include users from executives, managements, right on down to engineering and sales and marketing. All of your lines of business are going to be impacted by a migration to Office 365, so you want to pilot users, a representative sample of users from all of them. Now, the details of your test cases and your plans and your pilots are going to change from organization to organization, and we can't really help you there. But what we do want to do is just give you a few basic guidelines and a few easy steps that you can perform in order to help pilot this migration. Your first task will be to identify those pilot users who are going to make up that 5%. You want to make sure that you have a good list of pilot users so that you can keep in communication with them, maybe set up Slack channels or some kind of email chain that you can all communicate with each other and keep each other updated on how the pilot program is going. Microsoft, of course, has some recommendations for who these pilot users ought to be. We're talking about full-time employees. You want employees who are going to perform most of their job functions, relatively frequently within the pilot period. Part-time employee may go weeks or even months without performing a specific job function. They're not a great use case for piloting. You also want employees who are representative of the organization. And yeah, we talked about users from all lines of business. Well, you also want users who mix up the demographics of your business. So we're talking about people who are comfortable with technology, but also people who are uncomfortable with technology. You want users who are working remotely and users who are working locally in the office, and even users who travel a lot and have to work, from hotels and airplanes. So all of these different users who represent how your organization does business, you want to make sure you have a good sample from each of those different groups. You probably also want to focus on longer term employees. These are the kind of employees who are going to recognize less frequent job functions that they need to test during the pilot program, and are going to understand how to accurately test the results of anything that they do pilot. Finally, you're going to want users who are familiar with the on-premise versions of the software that they're going to be using in Office 365. So as an example, if you're planning to use SharePoint Online, get users who already know how to use on-premise SharePoint. If a user is brand new to SharePoint, they're not going to be a great candidate to test SharePoint Online. Another critical step that you want to perform before you perform your pilot is to identify workloads that have to remain on-premise. And there can be a lot of reasons that you'll have workloads you're not going to be able to move into the cloud. A couple of the really notable ones that Microsoft identifies: regional legislation. If you've got confidential data, medical data, financial data, moving that into a data center that's in a different region or in a different country may not be legal. There may be specific legislation for the geographic region that you're operating in that prevents you from doing that. You may have to keep that on your on-premise or inside the regional boundaries that you're operating in. You also may have latency requirements for some software. So yeah, Office 365 data centers, you're accessing it over the public internet. That's going to introduce more latency than accessing an application or accessing data in your local data center. If that latency is going to be too much of a problem, it may not be a good workload to move up into the cloud. And then lastly, you want to talk about partner access or legacy integration. If you have business partners that are accessing your data, accessing your applications, and that access is not going to be facilitated through Office 365, you may need to maintain that on-premise in-house so that you can keep those legacy connections open. I also want to show you a couple of little handy functions that we can use when we're setting up and preparing to pilot on Office 365. And first is going to be the Office 365 Health and Readiness Check. Here I've opened up my web browser to portal.office.com/tools, and we're going to look at this very first tool right here. Check your Office 365 configuration with the Health and Readiness Check. What this is going to do is download a little software component onto my desktop. Oh, I got to unblock my pop-ups in order for that to work. And this software component that it's going to download will check for my network configuration, my local network configuration, and see if that's compatible with the Office 365 configuration that I have set up. You can do a quick basic check that only takes a few minutes, or if you select advanced here, you can find a whole bunch of different advanced checks that you can run. Although notice the note there, it can take up an hour for these different advanced checks to run. So you want to make sure that you've planned out and you're appropriately set up to let these advanced checks run. Now what the health and readiness check is going to do is build a client launcher for me and then download it. And notice that when it's done building that and downloading that, I'll be able to click to launch it. And now the application will install and then it will run the connectivity checks that I want to run on my system. One of the things that's important to note here is that I am running on a independent, not domain join, not member of a domain computer, so I have a very simple configuration that this is checking for. If you run this in your organization and you are a member of a domain and you're connected to an Exchange server and you have other typical office or organizational setups, those checks are going to be more involved and this is going to take longer to perform simply due to the fact that there is more going on in your organization and there's more that the health and readiness check needs to observe or figure out. Now with that said, at the end I still get a check results report and I can see what passed and in this case what failed. I've actually got one results here under computer settings that failed, and if I expand that out, yeah, I can see the different settings that passed. Here's the failed pullout. If I pull that out, it's telling me that Opera, the web browser, doesn't work with Office 365. So it got a really in-depth and really informative message. I have Opera installed on this PC. Opera doesn't work with Office, and it wanted me to know that. I can either choose to ignore that or uninstall Opera, or from an organizational perspective, you can decide what that particular failure means to you and how you need to account for it when you pilot and when you test Office 365. Another important piloting step that I want to show you how to do here is how to set up a hybrid email setup for your users. So if you are migrating or considering migrating to Exchange Online and having all of your email flow through Office 365, you still only want to pilot that for your users. You don't want all of your emails to come through Office 365. You just want to test it for some email. So if we come over here to the Office 365 homepage, I've logged in as my global administrator user and I'm going to launch the admin panel. What I can do is I can set up my domain name to only receive emails for some users through Office 365. And the way I do that is twofold. To begin with, I'm going to scroll down to the Admin Center pull down here, and I'm going to find Exchange. I'm going to launch my Exchange Admin Center. Within the Exchange Admin Center, I'm going to come to the Mail Flow option on the left-hand side and select Accepted Domains. And here we can see all of the different domain names that I have associated with this tenant. Check out my nugget on custom domains if you're not understanding where these came from or how these got set up. Now let's come to cbtoffice.com, and I'm just going to double click it, which will launch me this little panel here. And I'm going to change this from authoritative to internal relay and click Save. Now what that means is that emails can be now forwarded from an outside or an external Exchange server into Office 365 at the cbtoffice.com domain name. It's internally relayed. So the second step of making this work is to come back to my Office Admin Center and scroll back up to my users and find the pilot users that I want to pilot. In this case, I'll choose Ben Finkel here. And I'm going to edit this user and I'm going to change them to cbtoffice.com. So now cbtoffice.com is the email address for this user. I'll click Save right here, close this, and I'm also going to make sure that I assign them a license to the E3 license that I have. And now that this is the case, what's going to happen is emails that get sent to my on-premise Exchange server can get forwarded up to Office 365. I, of course, have to configure that in the on-premise Exchange server. And once that's done, they will get forwarded to the users here, the recipients, inside of Exchange. Now I gave it a couple of minutes to build that mailbox, and then I clicked the refresh button right here, and that shows me that the mailbox for that user is built. And notice the email address is now benfinkel@cbtoffice.com. So emails will get forwarded up from my Exchange server once I've configured that into Office 365. I'll be able to access them through Outlook Online in my Office 365 account. And when I reply to an email from that account, the reply address will be benfinkel@cbtoffice.com. You can replicate this setup for each one of your pilot users. Change all of their domain names to the domain name that you wish to be the reply to address that you want to pilot on Office 365, and you can then pilot Exchange Online this way. So that concludes this nugget on planning a pilot for Office 365. Just to recap, a couple of prerequisite steps that you want to perform before you pilot or before you set up your pilot is to A, identify your pilot users. Find those 5% of users that are going to represent your organization when you test out Office 365. You also want to identify any workloads that you don't want to migrate or you don't need to test on Office 365 for whatever reason that might be. Once you've done that, you can perform health and readiness checks from different workstations around your organization, around your network, and you can set up users inside of Exchange Online to receive or pilot emails at your custom domain name without cutting over your entire organization. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.